Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. We are so delighted to welcome back Karida Brown for today's Author Meets Critics session, because Karida, for those of you who don't know, is a proud graduate of Brown's very own sociology department. And it's very beautiful and emotional and full circle, because Karida shared with me that yesterday was the day that she actually defended her dissertation here. And so how remarkable to have her back 1 year later, a proud graduate of Brown's sociology program, and now an assistant professor of sociology at UCLA. This is the last session in the year-long series on the critical sociologies of race and empire, supported by the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, and co-organized by Jose Itzigsohn, Jordan Camp, Kevin Escudero, Tina Park, Prav Kahal, and myself. Thank you to sponsorship from Tricia Rose and the CSREA, in addition for today's talk to the CSSJ, the Watson Institute, the Department of Sociology, and the Department of Anthropology. And it's such a great honor to introduce Karida today, but also such a daunting task. And so I called on a friend to ask what I should do. A fellow classmate of Karida's, Michael Rodriguez Moniz, who cannot be here today, but he wanted to frame the work with one short line in a text, and he said, "I'd like to say that Karida's work teaches us that great sociology can be, and indeed must be, a heartful sociology, a passionate sociology, and an unapologetic sociology." Karida is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at UCLA and also a faculty affiliate at the Bunch Center for African American Studies. She is a cultural sociology of race whose current research centers on the relationship between social transformations and the racist self. Her book manuscript is entitled Gone Home: Race and Roots Through Appalachia, and explores the ways in which African American identity was negotiated and transformed during this era of massive demographic, political, economic, and cultural change. But today, Karida will present 10 to 15 minutes of an overview of her current book, The Souls of Sociology, Articulating a Du Boisian Sociology, co-authored with Jose Itzigsohn and under contract at NYU Press. I want to take this moment also to praise this model of mentorship, which was incredible to watch. They co-authored a paper together, published and highly regarded in the Du Boisian Review, and has now blossomed into this incredible book project. Our esteemed critics are Tina Park, a fellow graduate student in the Department of Sociology, and Dan Hirschman, assistant professor in the department, who we have to give a special thank you to because he's already served as an esteemed critic for Julian Go's book in this series. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Karida.
Well, thank you. I just want to say, first of all, it's so good to be home. So thank you all for coming out. I want to thank the CSREA and Tricia Rose for inviting me out to come and do this here. And thank you for all of your hospitality into our wonderful, I won't call you all critics, I'll call you all interlocutors for this book project that it is in its early draft stage. This is actually the first time that that we've shared a draft of the manuscript. So thank you so much for engaging the work. Okay, so I'm going to just give a few broad sweeps about the book because I'm sure that our interlocutors will go into great detail about what they saw as interesting, important, or provocative about the text itself, and I want to make sure to give good time for remarks from both Jose and I, and a discussion amongst the group. So I'll start with the origin story of the book. My dissertation project was very much situated in what I'd like to call a Du Boisian tradition of sociology. So while there was no kind of blueprint for that for me, I definitely was thinking deeply with Du Bois as I was formulating not only the research design for my project, but in the writing itself. And I learned in my third year of graduate school that Jose also had a deep affinity and admiration for Du Bois's work. So he generously invited me to collaborate and co-author an article with him about Du Bois's theory of racialized modernity. That was a wonderful collaborative experience. It was, in fact, my first publication in a peer-reviewed journal. So that was a learning lesson for me that I kind of I'll keep for the rest of my life. But we learned that not only did we share an interest in Du Bois's sociology, but that there was so much more to be said. So Jose had an idea for years to write a book about Du Bois's sociology, and he just said, well, why not now, and invited me on to the larger book project. Fast forward to now, we have the early draft of the 4 empirical chapters of the book. We'll be weaving in the intro and conclusion after we hear all of your feedback. And the book is due to NYU Press in November, so we have some time to really think through the project and further develop it. So that's why this is just such an important opportunity for us to get this feedback. So that's the origin story of the book. So I want to talk about the political context through which this book emerged. This is really important for me to say now and for us to acknowledge explicitly early on in the text. There are generations of scholars, be it sociologists and folks across disciplines and fields, who have for years done the labor of pushing for Du Bois to be properly situated in the mainstream of sociology and, I would say, dare say, 20th century American thought. It's been an uphill battle. There have been dozens of books about Du Bois's contributions to education, race, sociology, visual studies, history. I could go on and on. So we are standing on the shoulders of giants in that regard, and we really want to acknowledge all of the work that needed to be done to just pave the way for the opportunity to come for this book. So because of this uphill battle, because Du Bois was very much situated at the margins of sociology, but many fields and disciplines at that. So that work of bringing him to the center had a certain politics to it, and specifically within the discipline of sociology, because we spent so much time arguing, no, he should be in the center, and this is why. These are the contributions that Du Bois made. Du Bois said that 30 years ago. There's been really little opportunity to articulate what is a Du Boisian sociology, if there is such a thing. So that is really the main aim that we are taking on for this book. We really want to provide that blueprint of what is a Du Boisian sociology, both from an empirical and theoretical standpoint. The way in which we approached that was through a very close reading of Du Bois's oeuvre. That includes his sociological texts that we're very familiar with, a la Souls of Black Folk, Black Reconstruction in America, and the Philadelphia Negro, which are the most, I'd say, widely read and cited texts within the discipline of sociology. However, Du Bois published prolifically over the span of 70 of his 95 years, and we wanted to make sure not to further elide his body of work. So we covered not only his books and articles, but also speeches. Du Bois wrote a children's book. Du Bois curated exhibitions. So we use all of those forms of publication as text, and we read it closely together as a body. So that is how the work that we did to excavate this Du Boisian sociology that he left for us. So we really just did the work of packaging that. And the second aim of the book is to connect that blueprint with its situated within its I think calling forth the contemporary implications of what this means for us as sociologists, as scholars, particularly the generation of scholars who are in undergraduate and graduate school formulating projects, scholars like myself who are just starting on the tenure track and defining myself within a field. This book really, we hope, will open up and add to the many pathways and modes of sociology. So for those who identify with Du Bois in a tradition, it kind of gives not only a blueprint but something citable to say, okay, this exists. It's out there. It's established. So it's very much forward-looking in that way, or at least we hope it to be. So I'll close with just remarking on where the book is. So, like I mentioned, we have these 4 substantive chapters drafted for the book. We envision having 2 revision cycles or 3 phases to the book project. So we've completed the first phase of just getting the ideas on the page and getting the structure of the text together. So we feel pretty comfortable that we're there. This discussion will kind of be the launching pad for us to go into that deep revision mode. So we really will take all of this feedback seriously. And then lastly, we'll take, once we have the manuscript kind of fully developed and completed, we'll do a really close look at form and narrativity, because it's also important how the book reads. Du Bois was very much conscious of his writerly voice, and I think that's why so much of his work persists today and has the appeal that it does. So we want to, in a Du Boisian tradition, also honor that. So it's something that, when students pick it up, they won't want to put it down. So we hope to accomplish that as well. So with that said, I'm sitting at the edge of my seat. I can't wait to hear from Tina and Dan. And once you all provide your remarks, Jose and I will respond, and then we can open it up for questions and discussion.
Great. I choose to stand. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. First off, a big thank you to Professors Brown and Itzigsohn for inviting me to review their book manuscript. And thank you for thinking of Dan and I as interlocutors rather than as critics. As a graduate student, I'm grateful for their work, as well as the groundbreaking work of other scholars, to bring sociologists back to Du Bois. For those of you who are not sociologists, just to give you a bit of context, a discussion like this 10 or 20 years ago would not have been so well supported or well attended. Du Bois had limited traction in the field, often relegated to certain subfields or sub-subfields even. As a student of sociology, you are unlikely to read Du Bois's work in class. If you're lucky, you might read the Philadelphia Negro in an urban sociology class, or skim a few essays from the Souls of Black Folk for a course on critical race studies. But for the most part, the best of sociology's thinkers can spend much of their career without ever engaging with Du Bois. And there are many possible reasons for Du Bois's exclusion from the discipline. In his award-winning book, The Scholar Denied, Professor Alden Morris argues that racism kept Du Bois out of professional sociology. As a Black scholar, Du Bois was kept out of the leading institutions on the forefront, which were constructing American sociology at that time. His social scientific research, which emphasized the social problems affecting Black community as being tied to structural phenomena, refuted the more common claims of innate, biologically determined Black inferiority and white superiority. Now today, most sociologists would not deny Du Bois's place in the discipline because he's Black, or because his research diverges from prevailing views. But this is not to say, however, that Du Bois has been fully embraced just because we, as sociologists, are a bit more open-minded. As I described earlier, Du Bois is present in the field, but only marginally so. He is recognized as a sociologist of race, perhaps an urban sociologist, but that tends to be it. he's far from being recognized as a canonical figure, as a founding father of American sociology. Now, Karida and Jose pick up the baton from Professor Morris to show us that Du Bois is a canonical figure, not only because he was one of the first professional sociologists in the United States, but because his work reflects a set of paradigmatic social theories distinct from, but complementary to, our other canonical social theorists. And thus, before them are a set of ambitious tasks. So in order to claim Du Bois as a foundational social theorist, they first have to show that Du Bois even has a unified social theory. Second, they must convince us that Du Bois' social theory is innovative and provide scholars with a basis and approach to sociological inquiry that is actually different from theorists like Marx, Durkheim, or Weber. And last, they must convince us that Du Bois' social theory, in addition to being different, is necessary to the discipline. In other words, they need to show us that the project isn't just about making amends for past mistakes, reincorporating a sociologist who's been ostracized, but about reintroducing the discipline to a theorist whose work will contribute to its growth and relevance. Now, I'm not going to comment on the worthiness of these undertakings because I don't think we would be in this room if we didn't already believe in the importance of this project. Rather, I'm going to focus on the ways in which they meet these goals in their manuscript, as well as the ways in which they may improve their argument. Now, Karida and Jose argue that a clear and unified set of social theories is present in Du Bois' work. But, and this is key, to fully grasp this, one must examine his full body of work and not just selections from his early period in Philadelphia and Atlanta. Now, this poses a few challenges. Karida mentioned a few of them. Du Bois was a prolific scholar. He was always writing, orating, curating, and he was an active scholar through his entire adult life, and I think he outlasted most people just generally. He was writing for a period that spans over 70 years. And to make matters more difficult, he worked in a variety of mediums. He published in academic publications, he prepared voluminous community-based research studies, scholarly works of nonfiction, as well as inspired works of fiction in the form of short stories, novels, and poems. He edited scholarly journals and mass circulation periodicals, including a children's magazine. He curated a photography exhibit and pageants. Then there are his speeches, his letter correspondences with other leaders and scholars of the time. Simply put, they need to attend to a very large and diverse opus to trace the articulation and evolution of his social theories. As they note in their manuscript, there is disagreement about whether, as sociologists, we should even be concerned with all of his work. Some critics, like sociologist Martin Blummer, make sharp distinctions between Du Bois' sociological work and his public activist work. Now, Jose and Karida are unequivocal about their stance on this issue. Of course, you have to consider all of his work, because Du Bois was always a sociologist, and he was always doing sociological work. By not engaging in this debate about what is or is not properly sociological, they're able to give greater attention to the insights that Du Bois' full range of work offers. And to be clear, I agree with them. One cannot prima facie know what does or does not fall within the boundaries of sociological work. I also appreciate that they sidestep this debate. Too often, debates over what is or is not are a distraction, and this focus keeps us from engaging in relevant and interesting sociological work. But at the same time, this debate is at the heart as to why Du Bois continues to be excluded from the sociological canon and why it has taken so long to develop a Du Boisian social theory. Yes, we no longer exclude Du Bois because he's a Black scholar or because he operated from a different set of assumptions in his sociological work. However, we do continue to marginalize him because of how he does his sociological work. I suspect that no one would dispute the notion that his work is always concerned with the social, these questions of how social structures operate and how they're constituted, perpetuated, and reshaped, how the historical and current structure of society affects individuals similarly or differently, and how individuals shape the structure of society. But like I said, his work was not always published in academic journals or presses. Sometimes he was speaking directly to other scholars, while other times he spoke to public intellectuals, artists, or even more generally to the public. He spoke to adults, and he even spoke to children. And as critics like Blummer might argue, these are the particular instances where his work is not immediately recognizable as scholarly or academic, or meant for an academic audience. Du Bois is not a sociologist, he's an activist. Which begs the question, Is sociology a matter of form? Is it a matter of intent? That is, must a scholar write specifically for a sociological audience to count as sociology? Must a scholar explicitly outline her social theory as sociological theory in a manner that would be generally recognized as academic and theoretical writing in order to count? And while these questions seem orthogonal to their project, it is precisely on these questions of what is or is not sociological which their whole book hinges. One must readily accept that sociology is a discipline based on plurality, a plurality of methodological approaches, a plurality of topics, a plurality of definitions of even social as a concept. And we have to believe in this in order to believe that Du Bois has enough sociological work from which to derive a theory. Now, this isn't an issue that can be reconciled in one book or even a set of books. However, if their book is able to attend to some of these concerns, tell us why and show us how sociology can be sociology, no matter what its form, it will go a long way to push the mainstream of our discipline to one side of this debate. So for example, the chapter on Du Bois's public sociology can be strengthened by a clear articulation of what is inherently sociological about his public-facing projects. You mentioned, they reference one, which is the Paris exposition, where he profiles a bunch of photographs of Black middle class. So there's a lot of reasons why this photography exhibit would be sociological, other than the fact that it's produced by a sociologist. So alongside these photographs of middle-class Black Americans, Du Bois presented sociological data about Black Americans through charts. Now these charts, which are artistic in their own right, I'm a quantitative person, so I really like charts and pretty charts. They also summarize the historic economic impact of Black folks in Georgia, like their income and expenditures, their tax contributions, and the assessed valuation of all taxable property owned. What could just be a visual exploration of the other side of the veil is transformed into an empirically grounded and organized account of Black America. So turning back to the question of if we can accept that Du Bois has a large body of sociological work from which to draw on, does he actually have a unified social theory? I already discussed how much he had written during his lifetime, so you can imagine it's no easy feat to go through Du Bois's whole corpus to trace his sociological thinking. Plus, because he wrote in so many different styles and to so many different audiences, there's no one central text that explicates his social theory. Delineating a Du Boisian social theory requires careful interpretation of many works over a period of 70 years. And I will say the authors do all of this. Their attention to all the various forms and the way that they evoke them throughout the manuscript indicates that they did really pay attention to everything. So what did they find? According to Karida and Jose, the major tenets of a Du Boisian social theory are as follows. And I'm paraphrasing much of their own words here, so please don't give me credit for that. First, the origins and effects of capitalist system can be understood by centering the analysis on race and class and the formation of their linked structures. Second, capitalist relations are global. For example, capitalism is not occurring in the metropole and being exported to the colonies later. Rather, the colonies have always been part of the capitalist project of the metropole, and you cannot understand the economic, political, and cultural processes of one without the other. And as an aside, a point I think is under-recognized by them in their assessment is that Du Bois also considered the presence of non-European empires, shifting away from the Eurocentric view that sociology can have. Third, in order to understand the formation, reproduction, and mechanization of racialized colonial capitalism, it's necessary to examine the lived experience of being racialized and colonized. The individual experiences shed light on the different ways the structures operate, while the structures can help explain the experiences of individuals. Furthermore, just as social structures affect the formation and experience of individuals, individuals can react to the structures, and they can do so in a variety of ways. The choices are not simply to assimilate or be destroyed. Self-assertion against the social structure is one option, while outright rebellion is the other. Finally, this theory is historically contingent. Like Marx, Du Bois's social theory is drawn from a particular moment and is not necessarily meant to explain every moment. The character of the relationship between race, class, and capitalism changes in different historical periods and geographies. These changes in themselves are worthy of study and can tell us a lot about the shifts in stratification, inequality, identity, or collective action. So to the question of whether or not Du Bois' social theory is distinct, I really believe that they show that emphasis on race, coloniality, and relationality already distinguishes it from the thinking of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And they show that while these other canonical theorists may have acknowledged the relevance of these things, they did not fully explore the explanatory power of some of these concepts. We have to remember, however, that this is an interpretation of Du Bois' work provided by them. And just as we've debated the intents and interpretations of many other social theorists, we will, I hope, debate the veracity of their interpretation of Du Bois' work. And hopefully in the future, we'll see other scholars offering their own reading of Du Bois. And finally, I turn to their last task. Have they convinced us that Du Bois' social theory, in addition to being different, is actually necessary to the discipline? Professors Brown and Itzigsohn describe what a Du Boisian sociology is, and I'm quoting here again. It places an emphasis on agency with a focus on historically constructed forms of power and structure that constrain and constitute the context for agency and a multi-method strategy of data collection. As a sort of a thought experiment, I considered the kinds of questions that might emerge from Du Boisian sociology and whether they're actually markedly different from what the mainstream is already asking. Now, if we accept the centrality of race and class in a capitalist social system, we may ask fewer questions about whether or not race matters, and more questions about what elements of race and class matter in a given context. If we accept that a rich world exists on the other side of the veil, that marginalized people construct worlds that are beyond the view of the dominant, we may focus less on why people are or are not assimilating into dominant society, and focus on the ways that people construct viable alternatives to assimilation. If we accept that sociological inquiry and interpretation can be expressed through a variety of platforms, we may focus less on maintaining certain disciplinary boundaries and focus more on assessing whether these platforms provide additional insights and what these insights might actually give us. If we accept that as sociologists, we are subject to the same social structures we study, we may worry less about achieving true objectivity or perfect laboratory-like conditions for our studies, and be more attentive to the ways in which our own sociological insights are limited, and ask what gaps remain or could be explored. Now, whether these are the kinds of questions we want to be asking, I think is subject to debate among sociologists, both in the mainstream and on the peripheries. I think as initiators of this debate, Jose and Karida can do more to tell us why these types of questions or different approaches to inquiry are indeed sociological. This does not mean that they need to wedge Du Bois into the language or definitions of mainstream sociology. I think they can actually draw from Du Bois' own definition of sociology to do this. But it has to be done. Now, there is a part of me that is tempted to demand more of the book. I want more textual evidence from Du Bois, more attention to why we should think broadly about what is sociological, more discussion about the role of gender in a Du Boisian sociology. But I catch myself and I realize that this is the commencement of all of these conversations and debates, and not the culmination. So with this in mind, I come back to the three questions I posed in the beginning. Do they show us that Du Bois has a unified social theory? Do they convince us that his theory is paradigmatic and innovative? Do they convince us that his social theory is necessary to the discipline? I think yes. Their articulation of a Du Boisian social theory is clear and is certainly different from the other canonical thinkers. In addition to informing questions relating to race and Black subjectivity, Du Bois' theory has the capacity to inform a diverse set of sociological questions. And his theory invites us to reorient our sociological imagination to ask a different set of questions from different standpoints. Whether you are a critic or an enthusiast of the social theory that they propose, I think they've certainly given us enough material to serve as a basis for a substantive discussion. Their book also provides the impetus to debate the content of Du Bois' work, as opposed to debating his inclusion or exclusion. So really, truly, I thank the authors for the tremendous labor of love that they put into writing this book and for kicking off a very different kind of conversation.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much for sharing your manuscript draft with us. and for inviting me to speak at this forum. It was a pleasure to read and to have a chance to think with you and with Bois. As this is a workshop aimed at helping to improve a work in progress, I'm going to spend most of my time on criticism, not because I'm in any way critical of the overall project, because I want to try to offer the most valuable feedback I can. One thing I realized I don't think any of us have done yet, is to spell out what the 4 chapters are. Okay. And I refer to them by number, so I'll just take a second to do that. So chapter 2 is about the theory of double consciousness, which is based on the earlier article I published. Chapter 3 is about Du Bois' dialogue with both Marxist theory and with sort of theories of global capitalism. Chapter 4 focuses on his more sort of traditionally understood empirical work, the Philadelphia Negro and the sort of statistical studies. And then chapter 5 is this really interesting take on his public intellectual work and how that fits into his ideas as a sociological theorist. In particular, as alluded to, this fantastic, that I had never heard of, story of his work on a children's magazine and children's books, which is super interesting. So that's the 4 chapters we had to read. I'll focus my comments on a set of 3 problematics that can be loosely summarized as questions of purpose and emphasis of the book, questions of theoretical definitions and boundary work, and questions about status and the character of sociology itself. Put differently, I'm going to ask, who is this book for? Given who is this book for, what would be the most useful way to write it? And then I'll ask, what does it mean to argue that Du Bois was a theorist? Why does it matter, for the purposes of the argument of the book, whether Du Bois was writing as a sociologist or a public intellectual at different points in his career? And finally, I'll ask about whether we think contemporary sociology even has a mainstream, and if it does, whether or not Jose and Karida's proposal for Du Boisian sociology falls inside or outside of that mainstream. So first, the genre question. What kind of a book is this? What kinds of arguments is it trying to make? I see some tensions in the current draft between approximately 3 kinds of book or kinds of argument. Some of these, I think, are not what the book intends to be, and arguments in these directions may distract from the real purpose of the book. And here, actually, Tina, I think, picked up on some of the same conversations, but I think read them slightly differently, so I'm excited to hear the conversation. So, the 3 possible genres I see for the souls of sociology. First, I see history of sociology. Is this a book like Morris's Scholar Denied, one which aims to recover Du Bois, in this case as a founding social theorist, in complement to Morris's argument that Du Bois is the founding sort of scientific sociologist? It's option 1. Second, is it a work of theoretical exegesis? That is this book about explaining to a modern audience what Du Bois really meant? This would be a work of intellectual history and deep interpretation, but one that would be sort of less focused on unpacking the social and political history of the thinker, as, say, Morris does, but also less focused on diagnosing the ills of contemporary sociology and providing solutions to those ills, and instead just more about understanding the texts themselves in their own terms. Or third, is this a work of social theory itself? I would put Julian Go's work on post-colonial theory in this camp. We talked about in the sort of previous session of this fantastic series. Go identifies certain problems in contemporary sociology and urges us to adopt new theoretical tools in order to solve those problems. Go's approach combines a kind of sociology of sociology, that is an identification of systematic problems and their structural roots in the way the discipline is done, with synthetic theorizing, drawing on a collection of ideas from other fields to offer new ideas for sociology. My sense in that is that Jose and Karida are aiming for the third model, and please correct me if that's not the case. That is, I think they want to offer the contemporary profession a Du Boisian social theory to guide a Du Boisian approach to empirical sociology. But along the way, I think they get, well, distracted occasionally by arguments that fit more into the history of sociology question about priority disputes and boundary maintenance and the like. Was Du Bois a social theorist? Was Du Bois a sociologist or a public intellectual in the 1920s, 1930s, etc.? They sort of assert that these debates are mostly resolved or important, but I think they still get bogged down in them sometimes. Priority disputes can be incredibly important. I don't want to deny their importance. But it has to be explained, and the right evidence has to be brought to bear to make the case for priority. That's exactly the task that Alden Morris takes on, right? In his analysis of Park and Du Bois' approach to urban sociology, and he does this in order to make a broader intervention in the history of sociology, and a broader argument also about the sociology of knowledge, using historical data to do so. For the argument that Jose and Karida want to make, on the other hand, I think these debates end up being a bit under evidence in the book, and more importantly, sort of beside the main point. On the other side, I think Jose and Karida may spend a little too much time explaining Du Bois in his own words, and not enough time telling us what to do with Du Bois, or what thinking with Du Bois can help us do. That is, I would like to see more of Jose and Karida theorizing and less exegesis of Du Bois's work. The second chapter, derived from their published article on double consciousness, does this the best right now, I think. Jose and Karida begin from a few passages in Souls of Black Folk and derive from them a much more satisfying theory of double consciousness. This is not simply a matter of uncovering what Du Bois really meant in those particular passages, but of theorizing with those texts and bringing them into dialogue with all the other developments in social theory and empirical sociology of the last 100 years, from feminist standpoint theory to symbolic interactionism. What Jose and Karida can offer us is not Du Bois's sociology, but a Du Boisian sociology. One of the reasons why I want to push Jose and Karida in this direction is that because I think it accords better with our understanding of how theory actually progresses in sociology, and even what theory is in sociology. Here, I'll switch from questions of genre to questions of boundaries. Was Du Bois a social theorist? What would it mean to answer that question? What does theory mean for Jose and Karida, and what should it mean for sociology more broadly? I would assert that we, collectively, get to decide the answer to those questions. Social theory as a field, as a canon, as an extended conversation, is not a matter of essences, but of deployments. Let me try to explain what I mean by way of analysis by Stefan Bargier of the reception of Erving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life. This work is now recognized as a classic of social theory. It's included on prelim exams for social theory, it's taught in contemporary theory classes, and we even get the adjective Goffmanian to identify a style of theorizing. But Bargier shows that earlier reviews of the book treated it as an atheoretical, empirical study. Goffman, not theoretical. How could this be? What Bargier argues is that works we identify now as kind of foundational social theory texts come in two broad camps: theories by design and theories by use. Theories by design are works like Parsons' Social System or Giddens' Constitution of Society. These works put forward some broad, abstract understanding, interconnected set of ideas, a logical system, all that jazz. The second category is what Bargier calls theories by use. Theories by use are typically empirical projects that generate some sets of ideas or insights that are picked up and modified for deployment in other contexts. Goffman's presentation of self is a theory by use. It became theory when other authors saw transposable insights in the text and adopted them to make sense of their own research site. So was Weber's Protestant ethic, for that matter. Du Bois is not, I would argue, primarily a theorist by design in the mold of Parsons or Giddens. Du Bois, rather, is a perfect case for the generative power of theory by use. Du Bois was deeply invested in empirical research, as Jose and Karida show nicely, especially in chapters 3 and 4. His empirical research, like all empirical research, was guided by various implicit and explicit theoretical priors, understanding what the world is made of and how it moves. The preface of Black Reconstruction is perhaps the most powerful instance that I know of Du Bois showing the power of these priors. I'm going to read it at length just because I love it so much, and I think it's okay. So Du Bois writes in the preface, it would only be fair to the reader to say frankly in advance that the attitude of any person towards this story will be distinctly influenced by his theories of the Negro race. If he believes that the Negro in America, and in general, is an average and ordinary human being who under given environment develops like other human beings, then he will read this story and judge it by the facts adduced. If, however, he regards the Negro as a distinctly inferior creature who can never successfully take part in modern civilization, and whose emancipation and enfranchisement were gestures against nature, then he will need something more than the sort of facts that I have set down. But this latter person I am not trying to convince. I am simply pointing out these two points of view, so obvious to Americans, and then without further ado, assuming the truth of the first. In fine, I am going to tell this story as though Negroes were ordinary human beings, realizing that this attitude from the first certainly can curtail my audience. Here we see how Du Bois's theory of race, social constructionist, focused on how environment and history made men unequal, not biology or essence, shaped his research. But Du Bois merely flags this assumption before proceeding with hundreds of pages of detailed and rich history. So stepping back, is Black Reconstruction a work of theory? I wonder if this is the wrong question. What if we ask instead, can we theorize with Black Reconstruction? Clearly, yes. Part of that work of theorizing will involve uncovering the assumptions which Du Bois so successfully brought to his work. Some explicit, like in that preface, some much more implicit, requiring the kind of exegesis that Jose and Karida sort of excellently do in their current manuscript. But much of that work involves building on Du Bois, both his assumptions and his actual findings, along with all the other work done since that influences our assessment of those assumptions and findings. We must recognize that this is an act of creating theory by use, not explaining theory by design. Jose and Karida are fantastic at this task when they set themselves to it, and I hope that in the revised manuscript they go further in this direction, not resting on just trying to tell us what Du Bois meant, but on elaborating what we can do with Du Bois. Here I think chapter 3 could particularly do more. Rather than just uncovering how Du Bois analyzed race and global capitalism together, and cobbling together what feels like a fairly standard list of theoretical desiderata for post-colonial theorists, like foregrounding subaltern agencies, what can Jose and Karida tell us about how we can analyze race and global capitalism differently by redeploying Du Bois's ideas and findings and approaches in new contexts? I'm not convinced by the text so far that Du Bois himself proposed a novel theory of capitalism. I am convinced that Jose and Karida can point us to a novel theory of capitalism by way of Du Bois. But right now, claims they end with claims like we should be more relational than Winant, but more structural than Bourdieu, which gives only kind of a vague heading and not a clear path forward. Where does following that path take us? What debates will it help us to clarify? By engaging in this task, Jose and Karida and their fellow travelers will make Du Bois a foundational social theorist. As Bois taught us in his analysis of Kafka and his precursors, we moderns decide which paths are relevant. Du Bois may not have been important to mid-20th century or even late 20th century sociology for all the reasons Morris elaborates and as Tina just talked about. But we can make him important now somewhat seamlessly because our precursors are in fact retrojections. The theory canon, as we know from, say, Ray Connell and many others, is a political construct. The canon is an act of a given present, relatively unmoored from the actual past. The same political story that elevated Durkheim but not Tard, or Marx but not Robert Owens, or etc. If we combine Connell's insights with Bargier's, I would argue that we, and more specifically you, can make Du Bois part of our collective canon of foundational social theory by theorizing with him, rather than by simply sort of announcing that you have found his foundational social theory already there laying about. So what would it mean to theorize with Du Bois? I think chapter 2 offers one excellent example of this, but they can go further throughout the rest of the book. For example, one of the biggest debates in sociological theory in general, and debates about race in the US or racialized global capitalism in specific, concerns what we all call the structure and agency problem. There are as many variations of this problem as there are sociologists probably, if not more, but Jose and Karida seem to imply that Du Bois will give us new ways to tackle this issue. I would like to hear more. To start with, I want to know how they define the problem in the first place. Theorizing with Du Bois, what is structure? What is agency? If we take Black Reconstruction, say, as a model for understanding the interplay of structure and agency, what can we learn about how we should define those terms and how we should analyze the larger problem? I should have mentioned somewhere along the way that I'm nowhere near an expert on Du Bois, so this is me kind of trying to fill in through the lens of their book. For me, one of the striking aspects of Black Reconstruction is how the importance of subaltern agency is an empirical question. That is, Du Bois's theoretical priors shape his approach and guide him to look for the possibility that the actions of slaves and recently freed slaves would be consequential to the outcome of the Civil War. But he empirically tests that question with historical data. It's not simply a matter of asserting the potential for agency or foregrounding that agency in the abstract, but in concretely identifying sets of consequential choices by relatively disempowered actors that collectively reshape larger outcomes. Theory led him to look, data showed him the answer. Another way to phrase this line of commentary would be a sort of social theory-specific version of the old writing dictum, show, don't tell. Chapter 3 is a lot of telling us what Du Bois' global sociology is like, but not a lot of showing it, and not a lot of showing what we can do with it. And both chapters 3 and 4 spend a lot of time asserting that Du Bois does it better, or could help us do it better, but not so much explicitly telling us what's already being done wrong and how we go about fixing it. Jose and Karida seem, I would say, uncharacteristically unwilling to call out specific authors or theories they believe get it wrong, where it is the analysis of racism in the US or global capitalism, and then to explain how thinking with Du Bois would show why those other approaches or findings are wrong and how we can do it better. Let me name a couple potential targets for Du Boisian critique, which might be usefully made explicit, showing how they're currently still important to the field, and then how Du Boisian thinking can help us surpass them. The first I have in mind is modernization theory, kind of an easy target, but still present. It's lurking teleological approach to development. Another might be sort of certain assimilationist approaches that assume a kind of unilinear incorporation process in migration. We get a smidgen of this in Jose's discussion of his own work on Dominican immigrants in Providence, but it couldn't be brought out more. And perhaps the third one could be sort of the recurrent debates on the culture of poverty, which we have a sort of new version of in the last 5 or 10 years. as an approach to understanding racial inequality, and especially sort of segregated, predominantly black urban neighborhoods, which would nicely tie back empirically to Du Bois' own sort of central work. What can thinking with Du Bois tell us about how this resurgent approach, cultural approach to poverty, is or isn't likely to pay off? What the dangers are, etc. Are we recreating past mistakes we could avoid, or are we already doing a kind of Du Boisian sociology but we just don't know it yet? Finally, and kind of to this latter point, I want to ask whether there is a sociological mainstream, and whether or not Du Boisian approaches fall inside or outside of it if there is one. As I sort of mentioned, I think at the Julian Go discussion, I'm not convinced that sociology has a core. I'm not convinced it has a mainstream, and the authors in a couple places allude to the fractured nature of the field. If there is a mainstream, we don't get a lot of evidence for who's in it, who's out of it, and what it means in this book, or in most of the places where it's discussed. So I want to know explicitly, what does that mean? What would it mean to think about a sociological mainstream and who's in it and who's out? There is, I think, in sociology a status hierarchy, one that clearly maps onto journals, university presses, and departments. But I'm not sure how well it can really be defined by content or theoretical approach or methodological approach or any of the axes we tend to fall back on when we dispute the kind of the fractured nature of the field. If we were to do a Du Boisian sociology of contemporary sociology, what sort of evidence would we bring to bear on what sorts of questions to determine how Du Boisian approaches, or compatible approaches motivated by other traditions, like Black feminist thought, say, are received? We might, for example, look at the list of exemplars Jose and Karida identify as kind of fellow travelers, and ask about how their work has been received, and where those authors teach, where they publish, etc. For example, in one of the few explicit mentions in the book of an actual debate between a kind of Du Boisian approach and a non-Du Boisian approach, they signal a discussion between Winant and Wimmer in Ethic and Racial Studies, I think. And they argue that Wimmer is more central to the field. I'm not so sure. For example, Omi and Winant's racial formation has almost 10,000 citations, as many as all of Wimmer's writings combined. Now, we can debate value of citation counts, and I'm totally on board. But they do suggest a recognition, if not authentic incorporation. And so, what would it mean to think about the contemporary field of sociology from this perspective? What kind of data would we bring to bear? We could list sort of the other fellow travelers they name, many of whom are sort of at high status cases, winning awards. Some of this is new. Some of this is a very successful outcome of the kind of social movement that Tina described having really taken hold in the last 5 years, and that's great. But what does it really mean if we think about the success of these approaches in high status venues, whether or not we're going to call it the mainstream? I was trying to think if I could find a single top 25 sociology department that didn't have someone you could identify as being either in this tradition or kind of a clear ally of it. And I'm not sure. Now, that's not to say it's dominant or anything, but just to say that I think it's somewhat more pervasive in high status places than sometimes we give it credit. Which is not to say we don't need Jose and Karida's book, nor that these approaches are already mainstream. I think a Du Boisian approach would also lead us to take very seriously the experiences of the scholars in those positions within those halls of status, which Jose and Karida allude to with a really interesting discussion of graduate students' difficulties in receiving support for projects in this tradition. That said, I do think this relatively broad presence in the field means there's an amazing opportunity for this book to rally together a loose collection of authors, already sort of well positioned, and give them a way to produce a more sustained conversation about the theoretical underpinnings of their approaches, and to identify which approaches fail on these terms and why. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to read the book, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Dan and Tina, for sharing those very engaging, close readings of the text, but as well as contextualizing them within the past and potential futures of sociology. And I just want to give some empirical evidence to the top 10 sociology department. I graduated from UCLA, and prior to Karida and Marcus Hunter joining that program, we had no Du Bois in my curriculum. So I do think it's changing, but that's something new that happened after I graduated in 2014. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Karida up to respond, and then we'll open up to Q&A where Jose will also chime in.
Okay. Okay, are these double mics gonna do that? I guess not. So Tina and Dan, thank you for those amazing, thoughtful comments. I'm going to respond with some generalizations because there's so much in what you said. I want to, Jose and I, to really think deeply about all of the comments and suggestions that you gave. So I want to start by a response that kind of brings together a point that Tina raised, and I think that Dan contextualized in a different way, but they're talking to each other. And that is this question of what Tina raised, what is and is not sociology? And Dan frames this in this question of the three genres, and I'll repeat those three genres as I heard you state them, Dan. Is this a work of recovery of historical sociology in the vein of Alden Morris? Is it a theoretical exegesis where we are excavating what Du Bois said and kind of packaging it and giving it to an audience for them to do with what they will? Or is this book a genre of social theory itself? And the way in which I'm thinking about these two provocations together is that this is at the crux of what makes this work political in a certain way. Because there are, I love the title of Alden Morris's book, The Scholar Denied. Du Bois is not the only scholar denied. And there are, that's why we have a discipline. We discipline ourselves with these with producing these boundaries, and this question of what is and is not sociology, we can kind of export that to various disciplines. I hear that over and over again from graduate students. When I was a graduate student, I think that question troubled me deeply and made me hesitate about my own work. And I know that was not a unique experience to myself, to my peers here at Brown, because now as I'm on the other side as an assistant professor at UCLA, I deal with the same thing. The first thing that I've got to get through with the graduate students who come into my office is before they can even talk about their work, they have to frame it with, well, I'm not sure that this is really sociology, but, and then they then elaborate this brilliant idea. So there's a politics there that is historically located, that is very much in the vein of exactly what Du Bois went through biographically through his journey as an intellectual. So when I think about these genres, and I really like the way that you framed that, I would say, while I wrote them horizontally, is this historical, a theoretical exegesis, or social theory itself, I want to change that into something that's more vertical. And I think about the book and its meta structure. So the response to that is all of them, but not necessarily all at the same time or to the same extent, depending on who the reader is, where they are located, and what the book is doing. So I'll unpack what I mean by this in terms of the meta structure of the text. Is it a work of historical sociology? Jose and I are intentional about the reason why we acknowledge the decades of scholars who did the work of resituating Du Bois within the discipline. That is exactly, that we're grateful for that work because we really want to get to the meat and potatoes of the theory and Du Bois's program itself. So no, this is not, what we came up with is we really want to disaggregate Du Bois' the man from a Du Boisian sociology, and those are two different things. So I hope that you all could see that there, and we'll be sure to kind of emphasize that explicitly in the introduction. But with that said, there's no way to disembody Du Bois and his work, so that historical kind of biographical trail that kind of looms over the entire text has to be there, because Du Bois was pushed to the margins of not only the discipline but in his career because of his race, because he embodied Blackness. So we have to trace historically Du Bois's biography along with the work that he was doing, because otherwise I feel like there would be an opportunity for a certain type of disingenuous slippage. Is it a theoretical exegesis? Yes, so it is the intention there. We have, Dan mentioned that there are a lot of block quotes in, what did you say, show, don't, tell, don't show.
Sure.
Well, we're like a peep show. We want to show a lot in this book because, so I came up with a heuristic this morning. It's an exegesis in that way because we want this to be like an Easter egg hunt for undergraduate and graduate students. Because Du Bois's work is not represented in broadly in sociological syllabi, or if that is occurring, it's definitely a new phenomenon. I'd say over the last 10 years, where it's become a mainstream thing to do. We want to leave those nuggets of what Du Bois was saying, how his thought was evolving as he articulated it across these 7 decades of productivity, because we are kind of stuck in this loop of Souls of Black Folk, Philadelphia Negro, and Black Reconstruction in America. That covers 1903 to 1935. Du Bois published his last work in 1957, and then 2 books came out posthumously after he died in 1963. So we leave those nuggets there to, while we can't focus deeply on each and every piece of work that he published, we can leave traces for folks to pick up on. And I don't want to reserve that just for students, but also there are many faculty who want to incorporate Du Bois into their curricula and also expand their reading of Du Bois, but it's like, where do you start? So there's that intentional work that we're doing there by sometimes just dropping a thick block quote for you. So we'll continue to think about, in terms of when we get to that stage of the form and the voice of the book, how much of Du Bois's voice makes it into this book, and how much of it is us telling you. So I like that show and tell, but that's definitely a tension that we want that to be there, and I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on that. So, and your third genre was, is it social theory itself? Yes, and I think that both Dan and Tina hit the nail on the point. Chapter 2 is the most developed, the chapter on the phenomenology, Du Bois's theory of double consciousness. That is the chapter that started off as a peer-reviewed article, so there is, it's further along than the other chapters. Yes, yes, we want to theorize with Du Bois, but I would dare say, I'd hesitate to say theorizing with Du Bois. We're thinking with him and kind of articulating a framework, an intellectual framework through which to engage with Du Bois, because there is no articulation of a Du Boisian sociology at this point that's concise. So I think it's really important to show. So we want that showing to really be front and center. However, there are plenty of areas for us to theorize up. I think the opportunity there really lies with that conversation about the contemporary implications. What can we do with the Du Boisian sociology? Now that we have not only, we can stop with the argument of was he a sociologist or not, right? That's squashed. So thank you, Aldo Morris and everyone else who's done that work, Earl Wright and a litany of other scholars. But this question of, well, if you want to pick this book up, we, I think, need to get to the point in the text where we expand those examples that we have and really give some suggestive arguments, be more prescriptive in that way, because I think as the text reads now, and from what I've heard from your comments, it's something where it's exciting and you can pick it up and work with it. However, the now what, I think, is an area that we really should push forward with. I also want to comment on this question of who is this book for? Congratulations, right? So the book is largely for. So Jose, I'm going to speak selfishly here. So this book for me is emerges out of because I feel like something was stolen from me. So when I was in graduate school, there was nothing like this for me, and had I had it, it would have just eased a lot of angst that I had about how I was approaching my research. It also would have given me an intellectual community of interlocutors. I would have been able to find that much more quickly than I was able to do, and I was able to do it here at a space like Brown. But I just think about all of those as yet scholars that would produce brilliant work who run the risk of being scholars denied. So for me, that is first and foremost who this book is for. I would say for its graduate students and undergraduate students who are looking to either think about graduate school or pursuing independent research. So the writing is very much geared towards this is what we would call in the vein of a Du Boisian sociology. He was an emancipatory scholar, so we wrote this text in an emancipatory mode, and we want to push that even further. So if you are stuck, we're trying to get you unstuck. If you are asleep, we're trying to get you woke. That is what this book is trying to do and who it's for. Does it fall in or outside of the sociological mainstream? Is there a sociological mainstream, and does that even matter? So Dan, I disagree. Yes, there's a mainstream sociology. Is there plurality in the discipline? Is the discipline capacious enough to kind of hold a body of disparate and or overlapping veins of research or subfields? Absolutely. I think that's one of the draws of sociology as a discipline. However, that power structure that you alluded to reproduces itself very much to me as an insider-outsider type of structure. And that matters because what we know is that there are types of work, there are scholars who are intentionally pushed out of that mainstream, who have not historically had the opportunity to enter the pearly gates of what my friend Martin Bullmer calls the pantheon of the sociological canon, right? So it's not the work itself that created that slippage. It is all the isms, right? So I think it's this move of speaking to the mainstream, situating in the mainstream, attacking the mainstream or critiquing the mainstream is really important because it's an invention, and so this is also a truth-telling project. So I mean that's up for debate, but when I walk into ASA every summer, I understand there's a mainstream sociology, and those hierarchies are very much a byproduct of that mainstream. And so that's one response there. Tina, I'm going to respond to your last point where you said that in reading the book you want more. You want to see gender, you want to see more quotes. Dan wants to see less, you want to see more, right? So this is also really important, and I think will be central to the framing of the book. yes, I want you to want more because then you go do it. That's the point. Du Bois couldn't be any, this is not an argument that Du Bois not only was the first to do everything, but he solved every problem. He did not. But what he did was leave us with a framework to think with. He left us with a sociological apparatus, a mode of being in a discipline. So Du Bois to me was horrible with his gender analysis. However, that his theory of double consciousness and the veil has been used in feminist theorizing to bring a new analysis of gender. And there are lots of examples of how scholars have kind of picked up a concept or theory of Du Bois's and taken and ran with it asking a different set of questions than Du Bois originally asked. So what we hope to do is bring together that Voltron, so you have the whole thing and you go do it. And that's really the thrust of the book. So there's so many great comments and questions, but I'm going to stop there. Jose and I will field questions and we'll open the discussion up. And as I pick through more of what you said, I'm probably going to interrupt and jump in and say some more stuff. So thank you.
Okay, great. So that leaves us with about 20 minutes for Q&A. And Jose, I'll let you field the questions. I don't want to learn.
One at a time, please. Yes, bro.
Something I wasn't considering before, but now after hearing the comments between Dan and Karida about the existence of a mainstream sociology, I'm wondering, what is it that one, I don't know, I ask all of you, how would one define, I guess in Karida's sense, what constitutes that mainstream that you see, and what doesn't constitute like the mainstream that you don't see? I'm wondering if the veil is out here.
I should feel that mercy.
Oh, well, sure, I'll start, but if you want to chime in. So, from my perspective, I think that this mainstream, it is like a veil. So Du Bois has a famous little story that he opens the first essay of Souls of Black Folk with, where he talks about playing outside with a group of young children. He's a young boy of 5 or 6 years old, and they have these beautiful greeting cards that the kids are exchanging. And there was a newcomer to the group of children, and one young girl, and Du Bois grew up in Barrington, Massachusetts, in an all-white neighborhood. So all of his friends were white, and so a newcomer comes to the group, and he passes her a card, and she doesn't really want to take it, but it was just such a slight, nanosecond experience, and that's when the veil emerged for Du Bois, and he then realized that it had something, he sensed, this has something to do with my race. And from that story, he gives us the theory of double consciousness, with double consciousness, second sight, and two-ness. So I say all that to say is, I will say that I've had that exchange card moment within the discipline, and we can think about the way in which, if we think of subfields as those cards that you're exchanging with the friends in the field, the way in which certain methods are privileged and performed as a more or less rigorous endeavor. And those things play out in human action, right? So they're not just boundaries out there in the ether or in the abstract. They very much influence the way in which we are with each other as an intellectual community. So for me, that mainstream is a reproduction of these card exchange moments, this veil of the discipline.
If I can chime in,
Sure.
That question caught me, and it's a profound one. And I was thinking about it in terms of sort of being a graduate student and having that moment of, can I ask this question? Mm-hmm. Can I do it in a way that I think will be the right way to answer that question? And then suddenly having that moment to be like, will it be recognizable by other people? Will it be accepted? Can I get published? Will I get a job? And in that way, I think we have this double consciousness around being sociologists, that there are some who don't fit whatever this nebulous mainstream is and are constantly thinking about what I'm trying to do being reflected back on by, the gatekeepers constantly telling us we should be doing it a slightly different way. And so I think if you surveyed a bunch of graduate students and asked them, what are you anxious about in terms of your work, that'll give us the contours of what the mainstream is in terms of what they think is not allowed. But I do think it's there. There's something present there. It's not necessarily a subfield. It's not necessarily a set of people or a set of institutions. It covers all of it.
And just to riff off of that, like situating this question within like the field, the institutional field, is not just all of the actors, including we've got to publish, right? So our main journals, or our pantheon journals, the American Journal of Sociology and the American Sociological Review, are kind of indicators of what sociology is. That's the mechanism through which one of the main ones through which we are re-articulating ourselves as a discipline. And I find it really interesting and important to point out that in 2012 when Omar Lizardo took over ASR?
Oh no, it's more recent than that, like 2015 or 2016.
Oh, even more recent than this. So the journal ASR recently moved to Notre Dame under the editorship of Omar Lizardo. And the first thing that he did as an editor was convened a group of leading qualitative and quantitative sociologists and did a deep analysis of the ways in which qualitative research is systematically rejected from our mainstream journal. So what does that say about folks who use that method? Is it mainstream or not? That's an indicator that there's something going on. And this task force that he convened had to, their mission was to publish a set of standards and criteria upon which qualitative research would be reviewed in the ASR journal, which was supposed to open up a pathway for that type of research to make it into what I would call the mainstream. So that's just kind of one example, I think, of when we're saying mainstream sociology. I think we're thinking of this both interactionally, but at the institutional level with our how that privilege then is structured.
So I just want to provide a little bit of pushback. Because I totally see what you're saying. I don't want to deny, for example, the presence of power, of status, of hierarchies, of whiteness or gender discipline, huge issues. But I think they cut across in kind of weird ways sometimes. And I was trying to think about it explicitly in the context that a Boisian sociology you're proposing, which isn't linked to a particular method, for example. Because you're right, there are ways in which journals reproduce kind of methodological hierarchies, clearly. And some have gotten better about this. AJS was never as bad as ASR in terms of valuing, say, urban ethnography. AJS has been doing that for like 100 years. ASR comes and goes in different ways. But when I looked at the list of actual sort of people you called on as sort of fellow travelers or already doing things that you saw fit in this approach, you need people like Massey and Denton, right? Who Massey's at Princeton, trained like half of the migration sociologists in the US. Their book won the Best ASC Book Award. Kimberly Huang, who's at UChicago and who won the Best Dissertation Award. I would put Chris Muller in this group, who's someone who does quantitative research, but explicitly using Du Bois's data and Du Boisian framework to unpack the history of racial disproportionality and criminal justice. Won the Best Dissertation Award at Berkeley. So I agree with you. There are lots of ways in which these cross-cutting sort of status hierarchies disadvantage certain kinds of work and certain kinds of scholars, like Massey, Chris Muller, notably white dudes, right? It probably matters. But I think there are ways in which the Du Boisian sociology you're proposing, in some sense, doesn't naturally fall into the same categories of exclusion of what we're constituting here as sort of in, out, whether you call it mainstream or not. I think there's something somewhat orthogonal about it, which may be sort of powerful and useful. Because I think the mainstream isn't so cohesively defined. It's defined in kind of a loose network affiliation of methods and journals and actors and presses and things that a lot fits in it to varying degrees. And I've heard grad students basically from every part of the discipline ask me, how's I'm doing sociology? I had a friend who published an ASR, could not figure out if she was doing sociology or not, right? And left the field to go work at the World Bank. So like, it's mysterious to a lot of people because we're such a weird field. That plays out differently in terms of career outcomes, et cetera, for all sorts of ways. But I think it's worth at least, putting to evidence and trying to figure out what you really mean by that. What's the essence of it, and how does it map onto the project you're proposing?
Got it.
Does that make?
It does.
Yeah. If I can say something. First, I want to thank Tina and Dan for the wonderful job they made. This is the second time I've asked Tina to comment on things, and she does such a wonderful job that I'm afraid that you are going to be asked more to do that. And it's the second time that Dan comments for us. He was in the Julian Go panel, and if we invited him again, it's because he's such a generous person and such a thoughtful person, and because he's not afraid to push back. And thoughtful criticism and thoughtful pushback is the best criticism one can get. So thanks, Dan. You will get a signed copy of our book. I don't know if it will compensate you for your travel, because they read drafts. It's not like a finished product. So thank you very much. You did a wonderful job. And related to mainstream, is there mainstream or not? Yeah, there are ways in which people in the mainstream do work that could be close to us with limits, but we are trying to set up, and you are right, it's not there because it's not there yet. But we are trying to set up, what is a Du Boisian society and what is both? What is Du Bois? Because, basically we are ambitious, and I don't know, we want to start a social movement. We want this to be a book that will be read by young scholars and will expand the boundaries of sociology. Not replace the mainstream, not replace sociology, but will allow to ask a series of questions that today may not be defined as sociology. For example, two current luminaries of sociology, Emil Bayer and Desmond, start their book on theories of race, saying that there was no theory of race before them. And we want to say, yes, there was a theory of race 100 years ago, a theory of the modernity that put race at the middle of it, and that started to look at it from the perspective of race, and that was 100 years ago. So, in a sense, the move is to expand the canon, because if everybody has to read Du Bois, then nobody can say there was no theory of race. There was an approach to modernity that, in the same way that Weber puts bureaucracy and rationalization, Marx puts class, Durkheim puts solidarity, Du Bois centers race and its intersections. So that way, everybody has to study race. That's the move. Mm-hmm. Take race from being a subfield to make it center to the study of sociology. And in that way, and also to, and for that we need to prove, and that's why we work so hard into prove that there was such a theory. And that's part of our goal, to prove that there is a Du Bois, that Du Bois had a sociology. So that's one move. The other move is to do the social theory part, which is the part that currently is less developed, which is, what does it mean for us in the present? Mm-hmm. And in that, yes, we want to do all the work that you pointed at. You were right on spot on what is missing and what we need to do. What all this, Du Bois thinking means to think. What is Du Bois' methodology? We think he had a methodology that was distinctively Du Boisian. What does it mean to think about capitalism as based in racism and coloniality in the present? Is the same thing as Julian Go proposed, or is it something else? We think that Du Bois was the first in dealing with this question of micro and macro subjectivity in the context, in a certain social context, and that it did better than many or most. So that's the part that is lacking, that we are working, and you were right on spot, and you gave us the task of what is lacking in, and that will be the conclusion, and expanding the conclusion of each chapter exactly with those questions, and then But before that, we needed to prove that there is such a thing as a Du Boisian social theory, and there is such a thing as a distinctive Du Boisian approach to empirical research. Because if there is not, then there is not distinctive Du Boisian sociology. So we are ambitious, and I think you point out to some of the tensions that we need to manage, and it's very important that we can convince you of that at some point. And
now you
it's a
can
work
sign yourself up to read the next draft of the manuscript.
But that's the goal. The goal is young scholars, Karida graduate students, undergraduate, that are starting, have a tool to say, I can ask a number of questions that I may not be able to ask today. We think that there is such a boundary, and we want to push it a little bit, not replace the others. And in that sense, it's something that at least I have been thinking, because, you are right. I mean, we try not to get into much argument with what there is, because if you try to get into much argument with what there is, then the discussion becomes, what is that argument? Did you describe it correctly? And my personal sense is, better avoid that. Let people discuss Du Bois and our reading of Du Bois. It may not be the right strategy, but that's the kind of thing we need to think. But she was trying to.
If possible, I have two questions, and you can choose which one you want to answer. The first one is there a limitation to calling it a Du Boisian sociology, and who you can allow into that advancement of the canon? And so, is there like an Anna Julia Cooper that is allowed into that sociological structure, even though she was before Du Bois, right? So how do we navigate those kind of waters? And I think that's the way you can get gender, but to say I'm sorry for all the non-Black people in this room, but to have to say there is a Du Boisian sociology, is that a power dynamic? Is that a structural rhetorical choice that you're trying to make in the field to say that there is a Du Boisian and not just like a critical theory of racialized sociology? And so that's the first question. And then the second one is, I kind of want to get into the text about globalism, the globalization of capitalism and race, and how that fits into a current paradigm of the way that neoliberalism is structured in the racialized state. So you can choose which one you want to answer, or you can answer both, or whatever.
I'll take one, and Jose, you can comment. So in the text, responding to the first question about is a Du Boisian sociology exclusive and/or capacious enough to kind of invite other thinkers and types of scholars who kind of move in a certain mode? I would say absolutely yes. One thing that we address in the last chapter of the book that I will expand upon and elaborate further is Du Bois very explicitly, he gives this famous speech that then gets printed in the Crisis about it's called the Criteria of Negro Art. He's talking to, this is an NAACP award ceremony, and he's talking to an audience that's largely comprised of scholars, poets, artists, writers, novelists, and he's telling that group of folks, he says, you have to keep doing your work for the work's sake, because 100 years from now someone might pick it up, and if you don't produce it, then the only stories about Black people that will be out there is what white folks wrote about us. And this was in 1924, we really don't want that, right? But he also cautions that you have to keep producing anyway, because acknowledging that this system was made for none of us to make it. So the few that do, we seem exceptional, but really, that's the paradox of what he calls the Black artist, which kind of fits into that whole genre. But he very much is aware of the constraints and this tension between constraints and structural constraints and chance. And he thinks about that in terms of what intellectual and scholarly production looks like when one person seems to be producing ideas, but really people have been saying it forever, and there are a collective of folks. And I'll also say that there are several moments throughout his career, several works that Du Bois he intentionally didn't work alone. And he was very much in that whole new Negro movement, post-Harlem Renaissance kind of way of producing, where he was producing with other sociologists, but other artists, other thinkers to produce studies and other works. So I'd say absolutely, because that's the way that he worked anyway.
I mean, yeah, to your question, two things. I mean, and I don't know if Karida agrees with this, but this is my own vision. But, we said we want to start a social movement, and, opening the doors. And, Du Bois, because of his great work and the recognition, is the first. But I would like, to open the door so, Anna Julia Cooper, Fanon, and other people can walk behind him and, create a space in which all these people are discussed and taught. And you can use Anna Julia Cooper really to build on Du Bois on the failed Du Bois analysis of gender, to really do a Du Boisian analysis of gender by looking at the work of her analysis. The other question, if I understood correctly, Du Bois, again, what's the value of setting a Du Boisian social theory? I mean, the concept of the racial state is a concept that is established in, critical studies, humanities, but, it was central to Du Bois. And if we can make the case that Du Bois was a canonical social theory, then the concept of racial state comes to the center of sociology. And then, but the question is, back to Dan's question, how do you think with it in the present? Because obviously, when Du Bois is talking about the racial state, he's talking about the end of Reconstruction. I mean, I think it's eerie that the parallels between then and now and the time in which Du Bois, but that's the question really of, what do you do with Du Bois? I mean, how do you take the ideas of Du Bois about the racial state and the racial basis of power to look at contemporary neoliberalism, Trumpism, whatever is, but those are the challenges of, a contemporary Du Boisian sociology. But in order to do that, first you have to say, okay, yes, we do have these tools that are ours, and the racial, because I say the racial state because you mentioned it, but there are others.
I want to pick up on this, go ahead, Lydia.
Go ahead, because it's not related to that.
And I really want this to be on tape, so this is why I don't want us to run out of time. How Jose says that he hopes that this starts a social movement. We just came from this wonderful social theory forum conference, and it was a Du Bois conference. And Jose and I and a couple other scholars, sociologists who very much call themselves Du Boisian scholars, really in talking about this book, but also this moment, this window of opportunity that's that was kind of inaugurated with The Scholar Denied in 2015 and has opened up a whole new conversation about Du Bois. This book, we hope, is like a bat signal for sociologists, and I'm looking at you, who would want to also identify and kind of shape and define what that means to call yourself a Du Boisian sociologist, but also so we can find each other. So it would be great to organize something within the ASA, a Du Boisian scholarly network, where these conversations, it doesn't start and end with what Jose and I say. I think that this book is opening that conversation so we can think about, in terms of a social movement and a body of scholars that move within the mainstream of the discipline. That's the yellow brick road that we're trying to ease on down with this project. So yes, Lydia.
So, I'll make it brief so that it gets on tape. I have more of a comment than a question. I'm not a sociologist, and I know that I am not a sociologist. I'm many other things. But I wanted to comment that I'm really excited about this project, and I think that your book has a lot of potential to send a bat signal, not just to other sociologists, but actually across disciplines for many scholars of race. I'm in Africana Studies, and even there, I don't actually see this type of project. Typically in Africana, we focus on Du Bois as political thought, right? And not necessarily as social theory, kind of in the same way that you all are looking at him here. Or people will take specific aspects of Du Bois and apply it. but I'm really excited about the cross and interdisciplinary implications of the work, and I hope that either in your conclusion or in your introduction that you will have an opportunity to address kind of that aspect, even in a paragraph, because I think part of the mainstream of sociology also reflects a mainstream that's in the academy, right? And all scholars who are in the academy who ask questions of race are systematically devalued. And I think that's the term that I actually didn't hear in this conversation about mainstream that I would offer, is that mainstreaming is really a question of value. It's a question of value of particular bodies who are doing work. It's also a question of value about which work means something in a particular society, right? And so I see that this book has the opportunity to really challenge some of those foundations across the university in terms of what it means to be a scholar that asks questions about race.
Thank you.
Just quickly, I study economists mostly, and one thing I was thinking about that I should have said is that when I think about what it means to have a mainstream in a discipline, other social sciences, it's just so much starker. You look at political science, look at economics, the mainstream is so much more mainstream and so much more policing its borders. The kind of work we're talking about, think about doing that in economics, for example, it's almost laughable, right? And that's where I think this kind of argument has a lot of teeth. In sociology, the boundaries are just more porous. They're not there, but they work a little different. And that's what my comparative ones was thinking about, but not explicitly stating. So thank you for bringing other disciplines, because that's exactly the kind of thing I'm thinking about. And there it might even be, in some sense, more important to have some of these conversations.
Sophia and Michael.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the question of the canonization process, and
We'll call Rome.
because something that I'm thinking about is, even if we think of the classical sociological theorists that we all read in grad school, for example, Marx, through the canonization process of Marx's work, we only read a select group of texts from his entire body of work. And that's what gets canonized, and that's what we all have to learn and we reproduce that. And we don't read, all his racist stuff, or and more explicitly racist stuff. And we also take for granted then the Eurocentricity in his work, because it becomes taken for granted and seen as this objective body of work. So I'm just wondering, as you want to canonize Du Bois, which I'm all behind that, I'm wondering how you think about your role in the selectivity of this 70 years of work. Which works should graduate students all read? And how are you making those decisions about which works we should value more than others?
That's a good question. So I don't know that I like that word canonization, or calling what we're doing canonization. It might be, but I want to think about that a little bit more before we say that. So with every constitution, with everything that we put on the table, it's erasing something else. So that choice process obviously is doing a certain type of work. So I'll address the last part of your question first. We also want to incorporate it as an appendix to the book, whether it be some sort of Du Boisian syllabus or some sort of roadmap of readings by theme. So, I don't think that it's our place to say who should read what and what selection of readings make it into, to the core of a Du Boisian sociology, but more so just leave that enumerated list kind of there for folks and thematize it a little bit. So scholars can do that work themselves. Oh, yeah. This question of I don't know that I ascribe to that canonization term. So you can go ahead and take that, Jose.
Well, yeah, I want to point to. I like your comment. I hope it's true. I mean, I was talking to our editor the other day about how to structure field endnotes and citations, and she was telling me, well, you should follow the historian's model because this book has crossover appeal. And I say, well, I don't know if you want that. But it's nice to hear that because she might be right. Now, the point, canonization, well, yeah, we can discuss it. But what to read? And the point is that at this point, anything is an expansion. So, Tina wants us to do the companion to our book. But, at this point, anything that you bring into, want to call it the canon, into, saying people should read this is an expansion of what they are currently reading. So, part of our argument is that really the Bois should be read in its, more of its work. Because what sociologists at least read is like, they read Black Reconstruction. No. They read the Philadelphia Negro. They mention perhaps the Atlanta Studies. They perhaps mention, Source of Black Folk. And, Charles Lemert and me are the only people who wrote about Black Reconstruction. And now D. Royster is doing that too. So, anything that we bring, it will be more than it's being read now. So, what we choose, we are trying to be broad. Say Black Reconstruction, the Atlanta Studies, Dark Water, but also, the World and Africa. And, if people read that, they're reading like almost
twice
6
as much,
times more than they're reading now. So, it's a slow process.
And this funny thing about canonization, if we are to pick up that word and think with it, it's funny not only what gets canonized, where you were talking about Marx's selected readings, but who gets canonized. So Marx never held an academic position at an institution, yet he's a canonical sociologist. So it's so funny that sleight of hand of calling this argument that Du Bois really wasn't a sociologist, he was an activist because he left the academy for a number of years and then came back, founded a journal that's still running, the Phylon. However, some folks who have never, held an academic appointment, we have no problem, we don't even question who's allowed to kind of cross those boundaries. So I think that's where I feel troubled by it because I understand why we have canons, but I find it deeply problematic. So I hesitate to reproduce that voluntarily.
Mike. So just quickly, just to add something to the conversation that I've never felt before, but I've sort of seen the glimmer of, but now I see it. I mean, Jose and Karida, your work has always been transformative for me. But it's newly transformative in the sense that it provides this kind of synthesis that enables conversation. So it's transformative, but that it now travels. And the reason why I think it travels so powerfully is that I'm now able to talk to colleagues. For instance, Linda Gucia is here from Kosovo, and we have been talking about the ways in which your previous article on double consciousness in the veil helps us talk in a new way, in a productive way, about the dynamics in Kosovo. So this is what I just want to mark as something that has not been already identified, because most of the conversation has been around the obvious places where Du Bois is central. But I think what your volume can do is to enable Du Bois's relevance to be found in new spaces. And that, therefore, the third TR word from transformative to traveling is that it will exist in translation. And as it exists in translation, it will have even more productive power, which sort of goes to the point. And that is that this is Du Boisian as foundation, but it's a Brownian in extension.
Sorry.
You always embarrass me at the last moment, Michael. So thank you, Professor Kennedy. He's one of my dissertation committee members, and thank you for your comment, for always coining a Brownian sociology. I don't think that's a thing, but yeah.
I say one thing about Marx and canons.
Okay.
I understand it. I wasn't around then.
Marx wasn't in the sociological canon until the 1960s,
Yeah.
right? And so I think it's a great example that the canon is this constantly reformed political construction. And that's why I'm sort of not interested in the question of whether or not Du Bois was a sociologist, because we decided Marx was a sociologist in 1960, and 1970 we didn't do that. And so it's, and I think that political game is being played powerfully right now, and this is a salvo in it. But I think the way to do that work is to show us how Du Bois is essential to asking our questions, not to show us that he was institutionally situated in the field, because who cares? We clearly don't, right? We are who we pick up and who we don't. We all read Foucault and Bourdieu, not because they were central to sociology, but because they were central to a particular game that we picked up, and you know what I mean? Like it's not how our canon works. And so I think if you're going to be tactical, figure out the rules for who gets in and how they get in, and play that script.
I want to, on behalf of the panel, thank the audience members for your attention and these really great questions that have generated a productive but unfortunately rare conversation. I hope that we can continue this over pastries in the back, and just 2 announcements. One, a reminder from 10 to noon tomorrow at the CSREA, just across the street at 96 Waterman. Karida will be discussing the production of this book, but talking through the nuts and bolts of what it's like, what the collaboration process has been like. I think helpful for grad students, but also for faculty to think about how to work through these kinds of collaborative projects. And then lastly, of course, any of this can be done without the help of Caitlin Murphy and Christina Downs. So thank you so much. And thanks once again to Karida Brown, Jose Itzigsohn for sharing this work with us, and to Dan Hirschman and Tina Park for the wonderful comments.